So it was all about the short revision of the steps of processing of the tissue. The first step is quite evident. That would be the collection. And it is where the entire process begins from. This is not the end, but the beginning step. After collection, almost immediately after collection, we do need to fixate, so that losses of the structure due to natural forces can be minimum. Right? So we need to fixate the tissue so as to preserve the structure. Now, since the bulk of the tissue is made up of water, first we need to remove the water. And that step is dehydration. Now, if the bulk of the tissue is removed, as we know, the bulk is made up of water. And if that water is dehydrated, that needs to be replaced by a material with which we dehydrate. That particular material is known as dehydrant material, or simply dehydrant. Now, this dehydrant material is a foreign substance, is a substance that is not intrinsic to the tissue, that is not a biological composition, but this is but a foreign substance that will enter into those parts of the cell from which water is to get removed. So as the dehydrant material enters into those parts of the cell from which water has to get removed, so parts of the cells are now replaced. Parts of cells, which parts? Water rich part. So this water rich parts would now be replaced. Replaced by what? Replaced by the dehydrant material, which is foreign. Now, in this process, though not intentionally, but accidentally, very frequently what we see is that this dehydrant material is entering into the cell in excess, which needs to be removed. Why does it need to be removed? So as to prevent, not actually cause, so as to prevent, again, that same thing, the structural loss. Now due to expansion, because if excess material enters into the inside of the cell instead of shrinking would now swell. We do not want that swelling event to happen. We want, when you are speaking of this word, preservation of the structure in vitro as it was in the biological organism. We need to have that structure preserved. So there should neither be shrinkage, nor should there be a swelling. But an excess can cause swelling. And to make sure that this doesn't cause any forms of swelling, the fourth step should thus be clearings. Clear? Is this step clear? Is the step of clearing clear to you? Done?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So once we find that the tissue is now fixed, water is removed, neither is there any presence of any extra foreign material in the tissue that we are processing, we'll move on to the next step. And the next step is to embed. Basically, the step will be to section, but in order to make a section, we first need to embed. Why do we need to embed before we make a section. The reason is the method of making a section is to use a very fine as well as extremely sharp what? Knife. No matter how sharp a knife you use, a deformity can occur in any material that is soft. The fixation method induces some degree of toughness to the tissue, though that degree of toughness is not sufficient always to prevent the deformation that can be produced by the knife. What kind of deformation am I speaking of? To illustrate that, take for example that this is a soft structure, and with another ink I am showing you the edge of the knife or the chopper that you would use to cut this soft structure in two parts. What happens at exactly this point of contact between the soft structure and the edge of the knife is that there is a local depression, right? To illustrate this, you can take your tip of finger and try to press with anything not very sharp, else you might cut your finger. But try to press anything in an attempt to cut this. Would you not find a small depression occurring at that area of press? There would be a small depression. So this localized deformation needs to be prevented again for that same purpose, that is preservation of the structure, minimization of the structural loss. Now, how do we do that? We have to first embed this soft material. Let me demonstrate the process out here. If this green color again represents the soft material, if this soft material is embedded into something that is relatively hard, so anything that is hard would resist deformation quite naturally. So if I now place the edge of my knife out here or the chopper out here, being the chopper very sharp and the surface on which the chopper is in contact very hard, there will be almost no deformation in this area that I'm putting the dots on. Additionally, as this deformation begins to take a shape, when will it begin to take a shape? As this knife approaches to this surface. From all the directions, there will be a opposition to this deforming force. Are you understanding what I'm trying to say? Are you now understanding what I'm trying to say?
Yes, sir.
So once
Yes, sir.
the deforming force meets an opposition, the natural consequence is that the deformation is now what? Is it not now minimized?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yes, sir.
It is minimized. How? Simply by opposing the deforming force generated by the edge of the knife. Clear? So we need to embed. That is a very basic reason why we do need to embed before sectioning. Embed even if the tissue, I mean, more so when the tissue is a soft in nature, in its consistency. Clear? So going back to the list of the steps, thus we should have embedding as the fifth step. After a successful embedding is done, we would now move to the sixth step, which definitely is sectioning. You do understand? What is it? The sectioning. Okay. Now, the section should be very thin. I think I've explained why the section should be very thin. Because of, in one word, we can say trans-illumination. Illumination means anything upon which light falls and gets reflected so that that thing becomes visible to our eye. That is the concept of illumination. We cannot see anything in the dark. If I switch off all the lights of this room, you would not be able to see me, even though my camera remain on. So we need light to see. Similarly, since the final step is to see, since the final step is to see, thus our purpose is to make the tissue as thin as possible. Is the concept clear now? Why do we need to make my tissue
Yes, sir.
as thin as possible? Because of trans-illumination. My camera is causing some disturbance, might be due to an issue with one of my hard drives. Anyways, let the class continue. So this trans-illumination is the very basic purpose for our need to section it into as fine slices as possible. Moving now to the next step, something that would, yes,
স্যার দুজন ওয়েটিং এ আছে।
Shubhodev. I can see only Ekjon. That is Shubhodev. I have admitted Shubhodev. Okay, can we now move to the next step? Though not many steps are left. So can we move now to the next step?
Yes, sir.
The next step is to mount. What is it? Mounting. Now, what do we do in this step? Or why do we do this particular step of mounting? See, after sectioning, the size of the tissue is now what? Reduced or increased?
Sir, reduced.
Reduced. So
Reduced.
don't reduced, fine. So don't you find it bit I mean, uneasy and uncomfortable to handle a very small thing as the size is reduced? Is it not a very difficult thing to handle a very small thing? And if you cannot handle
Yes,
that
sir.
thing, if you cannot hold that small
Yes.
thing with your hand, the natural effect of that will be you would again cause a deformity. Is
Yes,
that not true?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So as there is a tendency to have the tissue being deformed, we now need to mount that tissue on a particular material, most commonly a kind of a glass slide, which would allow us to
Yes, sir.
handle the finely sectioned tissue, to handle this tissue appropriately so that no deformation sets in. That means deformation means again structural loss sets in. So that's why you need to mount. See, these are all in an orderly fashion. I mean, you cannot just mount a tissue and thereafter you can section. No, that is not possible. I mean, the process follows an order. And this exactly is the order that is on your screen right now. And after you mount the tissue, next thing is to differentiate the individual structures in that tissue. And for that purpose, here is the second last step, that is staining. So staining is the second last step. What is the purpose of this particular step? This particular step helps us to differentiate individual structures of the finely sectioned, mounted tissue. So you can put as much amount of stain in it. You can even clear out the stain because the tissue is already fixated. Since water is not anymore present, there is no question of the stain getting dissolved in the water because we have removed all the water in the second step, that is the dehydrating step. So even if the stain that we are using is a water soluble stain, but there is now no question of water dissolving the stain in it. So how much stain would react to the biological molecules? Only that much stain will be picked up by the molecules present in the given tissue mass. The excess of the stain now will be very easily cleared. But consider that we are performing staining without dehydrating the tissue. Suppose if we bring the third step below the eighth step, what is the natural consequence then? Staining a non-dehydrated tissue. If we bring the third step below the eighth step, then there would be a staining without dehydration. If there be a staining without dehydration, then whatever part inside the cell is having water, all those parts would also pick up the color of the stain. So that means what? since most of the parts of the cell is having water, so all of the parts would be of the cell would be colored similarly, would be having the same color almost. But if we dehydrate and thereafter put the stain, then the purpose of differentiation would be met. Understood? Why dehydration step should precede and should never succeed the step of staining. Did you understand that why do we
Yes, sir.
need to maintain this sequence
Yes.
correct? We should always maintain
Yes,
this
sir.
sequence correct.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
after staining is over, I said already while I was mentioning this 8th step that we now move to the last step, and that last step is simply microscopy. There are many very different types of microscopes available in the market, but we now need to see, after we have differentiated the individual structures, the only thing that we last need to do is to see these individual different structures. Okay, though for diagnostic purposes, I must mention that after seeing the tissues, there is an additional step that needs to be executed. And that step, the 10th one, I would write it as here, is comparison. Now, most of the histologists do not consider this as an executable step. That means what comparison is not a, it is not a physically executable step. It is not a physically executable step because the concept of comparison is entirely done inside mind, intellectually. Are you now understanding? That means, as an histopathologist, you must have very clear concept of the morphological appearance of normal tissues. That concept should be there inside the mind of an histopathologist. Now, when that same histopathologist sees the collected specimens, collected and processed specimens under the microscopes, at once the step of comparison occurs in the mind of the histopathologist. That means the histologist already knows what to expect under the microscope if the tissues be normal. So with that knowledge of what is normal, if the histopathology puts his or her eye into the eyepiece, whatever can be seen by the histopathologist immediately gets compared against his or her knowledge of the normal structure. So if on a comparison, differences from normal are observed or detected, that leads us to the diagnosis. Is the concept now clear? What leads to the diagnosis? Are there any more doubts regarding this steps. Putting all the steps in a single view is this one. Go through, find out whatever questions you are having in this sequence of the activities that we need to perform as a regular or a routine histopathological process. You can raise the doubts and accordingly I shall explain. I'm putting an halt to this recording as of now so that you can silently go over through this list of steps. Okay, I could have repeated the steps once more in that short format. Anyways, if necessary, I will do it in the new session.